At 64 years old, George Clooney was, for decades, considered Hollywood's most committed bachelor, a man who publicly insisted he would never marry again after his first marriage ended. Then, in the summer of 2013, a dinner party at his home in Italy quietly changed the entire direction of his life. Within a year he was engaged. Within 2, he was married. Within 4, he was a father of twins. And through nearly all of it, one of the people who watched that transformation up close was his longtime friend and frequent co-star, Brad Pitt. This is the real, documented story of how George Clooney went from Hollywood's most famous single man to a husband and father, and what his decades-long friendship with Pitt reveals about the man behind the image. 4 years before he met his wife, Clooney had built a public reputation around being unattached. His first marriage, to actress Talia Balsam, ended in divorce in 1993, and in the 2 decades that followed, he was linked to a long list of well-known women, including Cameron Diaz, Charlize Theron, Lucy Liu, Lisa Snowdon, Elisabetta Canales, and Stacy Keibler, relationships that generated plenty of headlines but never led back to marriage. He spoke openly for years about being comfortable on his own, and that persona became such a defining part of his public identity that it seemed almost impossible to imagine him settling down. Part of what made that persona so durable on screen was his chemistry with the ensemble of actors he worked with repeatedly, especially Brad Pitt, with whom he'd first crossed paths indirectly back in the early 1990s, when both actors were up for the same role in Thelma and Louise, a part that ultimately went to Pitt. Their real partnership began years later, on the set of Ocean's 11 in 2001, a film that launched not just a hit trilogy but one of the most talked-about friendships in Hollywood. Over the following 2 decades, the two would work together repeatedly, on Ocean's 12, Ocean's 13, Burn After Reading, and eventually the 2024 thriller Wolves, building a friendship defined as much by elaborate pranks as by genuine loyalty. That dynamic between them has become something both men have spoken about candidly in interviews, most notably in a joint conversation with GQ. Clooney described their bond simply, explaining that they check in with each other regularly because life gets complicated and you need to know the people close to you are doing all right. Pitt, in that same conversation, said much the same thing from his side, noting that he often reaches out to Clooney specifically when things get difficult, describing him as someone with a rare ability to see the bigger picture clearly. It's the kind of friendship built less on grand declarations and more on decades of showing up, whether that meant elaborate practical jokes on set, like the time Pitt plastered fake posters around an Italian film location claiming Clooney insisted on being called Daddy Ocean, or simply picking up the phone during hard moments. That history matters because it means Pitt was one of the people genuinely present, on set and off, during the years when Clooney's life shifted from the Bachelor era to a completely different chapter. That shift began on an ordinary evening in July 2013, at Clooney's villa on Lake Como in Italy. According to Clooney's own account, given years later to The Hollywood Reporter and in an interview with David Letterman for his Netflix series, a mutual friend was passing through the area and asked if they could stop by, bringing along a woman named Amal Alamuddin, a Lebanese-British human rights lawyer. Clooney has joked that he didn't even have to leave his own house to meet the woman who would become his wife. What started as a casual introduction turned into a genuine connection, one that developed over time through conversations and a shared interest in humanitarian work, rather than the fast-moving, headline-driven romances he'd been associated with in the past. By his own account, the relationship with Amal felt different from the start, and Clooney has said plainly in interviews since that everything about his outlook changed after meeting her. He's described himself as someone who wasn't particularly looking to become a father, and has said that once he fell in love with Amal, that part of his life suddenly made sense in a way it hadn't before. The proposal itself, which Clooney has described in detail in interviews, took place on April 28, 2014, during what started as a low-key night at home. He made pasta for dinner, and afterward asked Amal to grab a lighter from a kitchen drawer, where he'd hidden an engagement ring. He said he had a specific playlist queued up featuring music connected to his aunt, the singer Rosemary Clooney, timed to a particular song, and that he spent a nervous 20 minutes on one knee waiting for her answer because she was too stunned to respond right away. It's a rare, unusually detailed account for a man who spent years deflecting personal questions with humor, and it stands out because of how specific and unguarded it is compared to the way he generally talked about his private life before then. The couple married later that year, on September 27, 2014, in a private ceremony in Venice attended by around 100 family members and friends. Amal wore a custom Oscar de la Renta gown, and Clooney wore a bespoke Giorgio Armani tuxedo, and despite trying to keep the location quiet, word eventually got out, drawing crowds of photographers and onlookers who gathered along the canals hoping to catch a glimpse of the couple arriving by boat. It became one of the most heavily covered celebrity weddings of the decade, not just because of who was getting married, but because of how thoroughly it seemed to contradict everything Clooney had said publicly for years about avoiding marriage altogether. Fatherhood followed a few years later. In February 2017, the couple announced they were expecting, and on June 6, 2017, Amal gave birth to fraternal twins, a daughter named Ella and a son named Alexander. Clooney was 56 years old at the time, and he's spoken since about how significant that transition felt for someone who had spent most of his adult life moving according to his own schedule, built around film sets, travel, and a level of independence that fatherhood simply doesn't allow. In various interviews over the years, he's talked about the practical realities of parenting twins later in life with humor and honesty, and he's also spoken more seriously about wanting to make the most of the time he has with his children, telling interviewers that he and Amal have made a point of focusing on packing as much into the coming decades together as they possibly can. Clooney's friendship with Pitt continued right alongside all of these life changes, rather than fading into the background. The two have remained visibly close through the years since Clooney's wedding, appearing together at events, continuing to work on projects together, and by all public accounts maintaining the same close, joking rapport they'd built decades earlier on the set of Ocean's 11. When the two reunited to film Wolves in 2023 and 2024, years after becoming husbands and fathers themselves, both men spoke publicly about how comfortable and familiar it felt to work together again, joking during press interviews about their long history and their ongoing habit of ribbing each other in front of cameras. That continuity says something meaningful on its own. A friendship built in the era of Clooney's bachelor reputation didn't disappear once that reputation changed. If anything, both men have described their bond as having grown steadier with time, less about the image of two famous single men enjoying Hollywood together and more about two people who've supported each other through very different chapters of adult life, including marriage, fatherhood, and the ordinary difficulties that come with getting older. It's worth noting, too, that much of what circulates online about Clooney's marriage, including recurring rumors about tension in his relationship with Amal or speculation involving his long friendship with frequent co-star Julia Roberts, isn't something either Clooney, Amal, or Pitt has ever confirmed. Clooney and Roberts have indeed worked together repeatedly, from Ocean's 11 through Money Monster and Ticket to Paradise, and their on-screen chemistry has fueled plenty of tabloid speculation over the years. But neither actor has ever indicated that their professional friendship represented anything beyond exactly that. A professional friendship built through repeated collaboration, the kind many actors who work together across decades naturally develop. Clooney has spoken warmly and openly about his marriage in interview after interview, describing Amal as the reason his life changed direction, without ever suggesting any of the strain that gossip sites have periodically implied. It's a useful reminder that headlines built around unnamed sources or unverified claims about a marriage are very different from what the people actually involved have said themselves. What the documented record actually shows is fairly straightforward, even if it's less dramatic than some of the speculation surrounding it. George Clooney spent roughly 2 decades building a public identity around being single, supported in large part by a close circle of friends, including Brad Pitt, with whom he shared some of the most visible years of that bachelor era on screen. Then, in his early 50s, he met a woman whose career and worldview were entirely separate from Hollywood, and by his own repeated public statements, that relationship reshaped his priorities in a way none of his previous relationships had. He got married in a small, heavily photographed ceremony in Venice, became a father to twins at 56, and has spent the years since talking openly, and often quite candidly, about how much that chapter of his life means to him. Meanwhile, his friendship with Pitt, one of the more durable relationships in an industry not always known for durability, has continued largely unchanged, built on the same mix of humor and genuine loyalty that defined it from the start on the set of Ocean's 11. Rather than a hidden secret waiting to be exposed, the real story of George Clooney's marriage is one that's been told fairly openly, in his own words, across more than a decade of interviews. It's the story of a man who spent years publicly resistant to the idea of marriage, until he met someone whose life and work gave him a reason to reconsider everything he thought he knew about what he wanted. And it's a story that unfolded, at least in part, alongside one of his oldest and closest friendships, a friendship that has weathered every stage of both men's very public lives. What do you think has kept George Clooney and